So welcome to this special open session, everyone, on the response to the global HIV and HCV epidemics. And I wanted to start off by thanking all the co-sponsors for this particular session. It's quite a group. We have the Center of Emerging Neglected Diseases. That's housed here at UC Berkeley, and then the Forum, which is my organization, the School of Public Health, the VISPA office, which is the Visiting Scholars and Postdoctoral Affairs, and the Vice Chancellor for Research is also contributing. I wanted to also give a very special thanks to Hillary Chen, who is still sitting out there. She actually carried the tables up and set things up, and she works for VISPA, and it was very helpful to have her help us set up. And also thanks to the folks from the Educational Technology Services and of course UCTV for their work in generating material out of this that can be used for a longer period of time after the session. I wanted to just give, because we have so many people that are visiting this class as opposed to the students that have been coming to all the previous 11 sessions, a little bit of the history and evolution of this course and why the Forum is sponsoring this course here in UC Berkeley through the School of Public Health. The Forum's program is actually based in Washington, D.C. But we have so many multiple examples of what I call drug development in action. And HIV and HCV are definitely two of them that the Forum has been working on. And we're starting some new projects, one on liver fibrosis, which is just being launched. There's a lot of drug development activity going on in antifibrotics to treat people with NASH and more progressed liver disease. We have a partnership with the FDA and with the European Medicines Association, and also a lot of partnerships with basically all the pharmaceutical and diagnostic companies that are involved in drug development in these areas. And this also then offers, I thought, some very great educational opportunities in terms of internships and fellowships. We've had many Berkeley students come and spend time with us in Washington and get hands-on experience regarding how policymakers make decisions around drug development, but also other public health issues. And then the last part of our educational mission is then offering this graduate level course in drug development here for students that are interested in biotech. And so why the focus on HIV and HCV? It's really a very much an ongoing, dynamic, public health responsive drug development program. In both of these areas. The HCV has been much more recent, but HIV has been going on for a long time, as you all know. And we've seen very rapid, but science and evidence-driven adaptation of the policies for submission of NDA packages to the FDA, so that the FDA has really been able to adapt to the new science and bring about these changes and the requirements for filing that was in part due to having these multi-stakeholder dialogues that allowed that to happen. So it's really a real-time laboratory for regulatory science. And in terms of the HIV epidemic, it really has been the driver for major changes in drug development that have then affected the whole regulatory program also for other diseases. And it's really been a paradigm shift in terms of accelerated approval, the validation of surrogate markers, expanded access, compassionate use, et cetera. And we have 25 unique drugs in 6 classes developed over a period of 30 years or less, 6 fixed-dose combinations for use in this country. And there's over 150 generic drug products available for global use. And one of the readings you were assigned was written by Andy Quinones-Rivera, who was an intern with us a couple of years ago, who actually researched the policy changes behind the PEPFAR program that allowed the manufacturing of generic drug products that were manufactured outside of the US and just used in PEPFAR countries outside of the US, but reviewed and approved by the FDA. And that was really what allowed the PEPFAR program to move forward. HCV has also much more recently seen very rapid advancement, and this is a figure. I'm really showing off our interns here today. This is Courtney Hutchison, who did an internship with us this summer, who has a paper coming out in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. And as you can see here at the bottom, You know, we used to just have interferon monotherapy. This is the 1990s. Then shortly after 2000, we had pegylated interferon ribavirin, which was a very onerous treatment. And then the first direct-acting antivirals were approved in 2012. And then we had the next group of direct-acting antivirals approved just at the beginning of this, end of last year. And one more submission is here, which has been submitted. And then I didn't even update this from the most recent conference in London, but this was the AASLD conference in DC last November. And then these were data that were presented at the CROI conference in March in Boston. And you can see that in terms of the sustained virologic response rate, we've gone all the way from 7 to 20% to basically now 95 to 100%. For all kinds of patients, all kinds of genotypes, and it's just impossible to make this table to really show the advancement because of the incredible different types of patient populations that can now be treated with nearly 100% response rate, and also shortening the treatment to 6 to 12 weeks without the need for interferon and ribavirin. So that's an incredible advancement over the last few years. So in terms of the focus we have at the forum on drug development and regulatory processes, the advantages that we bring to the table is that we really involve all concerned stakeholders. We provide the cross-Atlantic regulatory perspectives and also the cross-Atlantic community and academic perspectives. And I just want to I always like to show off this slide because it shows you all the different organizations and entities that we work with that are either formal members of the forum or collaborators that we have worked with, and many of you are in the room here today. So the forum at Berkeley then in the Bay Area, there's a lot of biotech here, we all know that, and there's a lot of programs here and at UC Santa Cruz and UCSF in translational medicine, bioengineering, et cetera. But a lot of that really focused on the earlier stages of discovery and R&D. And what we can provide is experience in the later phases when things actually go into clinical trials and get approved, and looking at things like post-marketing safety, et cetera. So I think it's just a very complementary focus that we bring to this topic. In terms of the public health burden, HIV, I think this is not news to anyone in this room. 35.3 million people living with HIV worldwide, and that's actually gone up because people are living longer. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, that represents 1 in 20 adults. But the good news is that new infections are declining, only 2.3 million in 2012, which was a 33% reduction from 2001. And deaths are also declining, only 1.6 million deaths, which were down from 2.3 in 2005. So a lot of advancement, not just in drug development, but also on the global scale. And that happened because there was a lot of activism, there were champions, and there was funding. And just a few pictures of people that you know well. The Elizabeth Glaser AIDS Foundation, the Ryan White CARE Act, Ted Kennedy, who was really responsible for putting that in place. And of course, also people with high-level impact. And a lot of funding and organizational support through OGAC and PEPFAR, the Global Fund, the World Bank, UNAIDS, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, et cetera. When we then look at the global health burden of HCV, we have about 130 to 180 million infections worldwide. That really represents 2 to 3% of the total population, with more than 350,000 deaths. And these are estimates that are known to be too low. There's really much more than that, with very many very serious long-term complications. And this map shows you the concentrated areas. So where it's red is where it's really bad. But what's also disturbing is the many white areas that you can see in places where there really is no data. So when we then look at the response to HCV, we say activism, question mark, who's championing it, and who's funding it. And if we go back and look at the funding and organizational support for HIV, and then we have HCV, and there's no PEPFAR for HCV, there's no global fund. The World Bank doesn't have its own program. There's no UN HCV, as there is UNAIDS. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation so far has not really made a commitment to this area at all. So two totally different scenarios for what's actually happening. I had assigned 2 readings just this week because these were New England Journal of Medicine editorials or commentaries that came out, one by Raymond Chung. And I wanted to just point out a few things that they said in this editorial, and which kind of goes back to the role of the regulatory process. So it was when the Food and Drug Administration agreed to permit phase 2 trials to use new combinations of HCV DAAs without requiring a standard of care comparator. And these are things we've discussed in class before. And that really then allowed the pace of the ensuing clinical drug development to have been breathtaking. And it may be possible to imagine a global eradication of HCV infection, but 3 major challenges remain. So it's the same thing as with HIV. So infection is often diagnosed at a late stage, the high cost of direct-acting antivirals, and reinfection remains a possibility. But in terms of the length of treatment and the actual achievement of a cure in HCV, is a very stark contrast to HIV, which still requires lifelong treatment, and we can't cure it. And once the person is infected, the infection will last for life. A second paper that we had assigned was by Channa Jayasekera from Stanford. And Channa, are you here? He was going to try and make it to class tonight because he was just down the road. He's down the road at Stanford talking about the need to develop programs for treating hepatitis C in lower income countries. And I'll just focus on this last statement here right out of his paper. Seldom in the history of medicine have such definite curative therapies been developed for a disease so widespread and consequential to human health. We believe that robust efforts towards equitable access to these advancements are imperative. And with that, I'd like to introduce our 3 guest lecturers and panelists. They have kindly decided not to use slides, so that makes it easier on you. And what we will do is I'll ask them to come up and take a place at the table here. And we will ask each of you to start off with some comments. And then we will go into a moderated panel discussion. And then at the end, I'll ask Art Reingold, who's leading the Institute for Global Health for the School of Public Health, to make a few closing comments. So that's it in terms of presentations. And Gregg, actually, let's start at the other end. Okay. So Eric, if you would start and give us some of your thoughts about the key factors. So Eric Goosby is now at UCSF in the Department of Global Health Sciences. He used to run the PEPFAR program, so he's Ambassador Goosby. And you were in Washington for 5 years. I thought it was 6 years. You've been there for 5 years. Yep. So absolute first-hand experience with the challenges of implementation of programs, the lack of regulatory infrastructure, the availability of generics, all of those different things. So in terms of the class here and people interested in both drug development and regulatory issues, what were some of your key findings and experiences at PEPFAR that you'd like to share?
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me to participate in this forum. I guess PEPFAR's focus on the response was really an attempt to, in 2003, there were only 50,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa receiving antiretroviral therapy. The morbidity and mortality was huge. The nature of HIV is that it dominates and congests inpatient services in medical delivery systems. So if any of you had traveled in sub-Saharan Africa in those years, you would have seen late-stage disease coming into the medical delivery system through hospitals. There was no real outpatient identification and response. In the hospital, you had a full census with opportunistic infections. It was common to see 2 to 4 people in a bed, people in the hallways lying under the bed, on mats or on the floor. as well as out into the area around the hospital. People were waiting 6 weeks to 2 months to bury their loved ones because the queue was so long. Places like Zambia in and around Lusaka were looking for running out of wood because of coffin manufacturing. There were countless examples of local bush pilots in airplanes flying over areas that had used certain villages as visual markers at night for night flying because they'd see the lights from the village that just went black because whole villages were lost in this unresponded to epidemic. Out of the 34 million people, more like 30, somewhere around 32 to 34 million people, the number has changed with better ability to model and guesstimate. But 34 million people, you had about 74% of those individuals on the planet in sub-Saharan Africa. The majority of them were in 36 countries. In 2003, President Bush, because of a commitment really to try to respond to the suffering and death that this disease was putting forth, started the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It started in 15 countries, went to 78 countries, had a focus on treatment, care, and prevention services, as well as focusing on orphans and vulnerable children. With all of the deaths, a tremendous number of orphans came out of just HIV-related orphans were created. PEPFAR in 2008 had 1.7 million people that were being treated with antiretrovirals, had about the same number of orphans and vulnerable children, had a rudimentary prevention of mother-to-child transmission program because it's really very difficult to jump right to finding HIV-positive pregnant women without a treatment capability in place. So the early years of PEPFAR really trickled prevention of transmission to babies. Pediatric care was not done in any numbers in those years. In 2009, with the President Obama's administration, the ability to expand services was really dependent on our ability to use the resources we had better and allow for an expansion of numbers of people and a drop in the number of people dying. Numbers of people entered. So from at the end of 08, the 1.7, by the end of 13, went up to 6.8 million. So 1.7 to 6.8. The orphans and vulnerable children, about the same number of orphans in 08, went up to 5.8 million. We had a prevention of mother-to-child effort that was intensified in partnership with UNAIDS and UNICEF as the central partners, but many played a role in making this happen, the Gates Foundation in particular, allowing us to start a PMTCT program. In 09, there were about 490,000 children born on the planet, HIV positive. Most all of them were coming from 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but if you went up to 22, you had 87, almost 90%. 72,000 children were born in Nigeria alone. It was the worst country, the highest burden, and then South Africa came after that. Dropped with the kind of rolling out of prevention of mother-to-child transmission, going from a nevirapine-based single-dose pill to 2 drugs, and then ending in the last year and a half with a recommendation to use 3 drugs for a HIV-positive pregnant woman, which took your ability to drop transmission down to less than 1.5%, less than 2% in some studies. As you remember, if you're HIV positive, untreated, your chance of transmitting to the fetus and the baby is about 25 to 27%. With nevirapine, it dropped down to about 12% single-dose therapy during labor and followed with the mother and baby after. And then with AZT3TC or tenofovir, went with emtricitabine, the Truvada tablet, 2 drugs. It dropped down to somewhere around 5. And then with 3 drugs, it dropped to the below 2. And in some studies with good compliance, good adherence, it drops down below 1. So we were able to take the 490, it's now dropped that. So just to give you a feel for the scale of this, in 2012, in 2012, there were, we did about 50 million HIV tests. We found 790,000 HIV positive pregnant women and started them on antiretroviral drugs, either 2 or 3, depending on if you're, early in that year it was 2, and then about in the middle of the year we flipped over to really recommending, insisting on 3. Dropped that down to the 790,000 women on drug, and that prevented 240,000 babies from being born positive. So we're now somewhere around 180,000 children born annually. This hasn't been published yet, but the numbers are in OGAC, in PEPFAR now. So that publication will come out over the next little bit. But I say that to show you the scale, but also the complexity of converging the science and our knowledge and understanding of what we need to do, what we can do to impact these numbers. But the logistics of getting procurement distribution systems, hospitals and clinics, both the adult medicine, pediatric, and OB/GYN care, health professionals aligned with systems that allow for rapid identification, not a loss to follow-up. We have a huge kind of bleed-out rate with tested to staged to initiation of antiretrovirals, continuation, and then the ability to get that individual undetectable as the final target. There's a huge drop-off there that we really focused on aggressively with the PMTCT scale-up. So the ability to do that and to move from the 1.7 to the 6.8 million people on drug, just from a PEPFAR program's perspective, would not have happened had the generics not been available. The first decision we made when I started as the OGAC Global AIDS Coordinator was the identification and removal of D4T as a first-line drug in many of the countries we were in. This is a drug that's very effective in stopping replication, but it is fraught with peripheral neuropathy and pancreatitis that is quite severe and, in many patients, permanent. Numbness and tingling, burning of the feet and hands, so much so that, you know, clothing or a sheet brushing over a foot can send kind of lancinating pains up the patient's leg. Many patients in the early years committed suicide around the severity and chronicity of that pain. They were unable to cope with it. So this is severe pain in many patients. So we were able to move to a drug that has been shown to have very few side effects, concern around renal insufficiency and bone density. You can kind of identify the cohorts or individuals that may be at highest risk for that, but these are rare events. Essentially drugs that are well tolerated, patients often don't know they're on them. Having those drugs available in a generic form allowed us to move from the 1.7 to the 6.8. I would just say in the ability for us to do that had to have the complicity of both the brand manufacturer, in this case it was Gilead, and high-quality drugs coming out of a number of generic manufacturers that were mostly based in India at the time. And without that collegial willingness to share the chemistry and the kind of logistics, the procurement distribution logistics, without the ability to open that up, we would still be looking at either inferior drugs or drugs that cost so much because of brand. So the other thing I should mention, and then I'll be quiet, we had about 57% of the drugs in 2009 were still branded. Okay, so we were still using brand drugs. That had come down from really about 90% over the last, in the late 07 to 08 period, so relatively recent. We shifted it to 98% generic. The only non-generic drugs we purchased for PEPFAR really fell into second-line pediatric drugs. So, it really is a funny way to kind of run an airline when you think about it, but our drug, we are dependent on the pharmaceutical industry to take the drug to the point where we are ready to put pills in mouth. And until governments or institutions like WHO start manufacturing drugs, or I think more appropriately, contract out with drug companies to manufacture orphan drugs or drugs that are drugs that are for diseases that aren't ever going to be profitable, we are going to be dependent on this relationship. And I think it is the future for us to learn how to understand the challenges and issues that are in front of pharmaceutical companies, to understand them in detail, so there's a trust that evolves out of it, and to work together so we can drop morbidity and mortality on the planet. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Eric. Steph.
You want me to go next?
Okay, I will.
We switch order?
That's how I had listed. Okay, go ahead.
Any particular questions, or should I?
I think if you could talk from your perspective and both HIV and HCV, why, I mean, it's no secret in the room that Gilead has been particularly proactive about forming these relationships with generic manufacturers, and you've had that vision early on. And when I asked you to come to this class, I said the message I want the class to leave with is, if you're going to develop a product or a device, you need to have global access in mind from the very beginning. And I think the way your company has approached that is a very valuable lesson. And other companies are doing that as well, but I think Gilead really has taken on some major leadership here. So if you could talk about that perspective, why you guys are doing that, and how you see the future of both HIV and HCV treatment.
Okay, so I think I'll start with why are we doing that, and I get that question a lot, and people are looking for different motivations in terms of what we're doing globally, and I think there's two simple ways to answer that. Number one is because it's the right thing to do, because patients need the drug in these markets that Eric's talking about, and number two, because we can do it. That we've set up a model at Gilead where we can be a very profitable company to generate the research and development incentives that Eric spoke about, but also be able to transfer that science over to benefit patients where simply paying even at cost is a challenge for them. So this started in 2000. In 2001, we launched our first real product at Gilead. We'd been around since 1987. And we're just located over in Foster City. And in 2001, we launched a product called Viriad, or tenofovir disoprosyl fumarate. And this was one of the drugs in the cocktail for HIV that was unique in terms of what Eric spoke about, in terms of had a very good safety profile, also a very good resistance profile. You didn't see development of resistance to this, which was at the time one of the major challenges of treating HIV. that's pretty much gone away now. You don't really hear people talking that much about resistance anymore like we did 10, 15 years ago. That was the big deal. And then it's also one pill once a day. And so it was very simple to take. You could take it with or without food. So a lot of the complicated regimens that people were taking became much more simple with this one. So at the time before that, people were taking 30, 32 pills a day. So if you think about the developing world, being able to make things more simple, much safer, where they're not getting the neuropathy and other issues that Eric was speaking about, you're not seeing development of resistance, which is really hard to track and monitor in a developing world setting, and very, very safe. This was an ideal drug for the developing world. And I always remember that our CEO, John Martin, came to me and he said, you need to figure out how to get this available in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and places that really need this. And so this is 2001, and so I was fairly new at Gilead at the time. I'd been at Gilead for about 2 years, and so I thought this is a great project. So I did research for about 4 days. It took about 4 days to figure out that there was no model out there that was working, because I went on all the websites, I did research what other companies were doing, and nothing was working. There's a lot of PR, but I didn't see any evidence that any drugs were really getting into places like South Africa, for example, at the time. So we kind of had to make it up on our own, and so we decided to figure out, what are the real barriers here, or what are the barriers that we were aware of at the time, which we were pretty naive at the time. And we thought we were really focused on cost. We need to really get the cost down. And so we thought, well, we'll take a basket of countries, really the poor countries of the world, and we'll provide the product at our manufacturing cost, and we'll bypass all the complex regulatory requirements in these markets and just directly ship the product. And we came up with this model to do that. And we did that for that really kicked off in about 2003, and we did that for about 3 years. And in about 3 years, I think we got up to a grand total of about 20,000 patients on treatment, which was an utter failure at the time. And a couple things we learned between 2003 and 2006. A lot of us was talking to the NGOs, particularly MSF, but a number of other NGOs, actually Pangea, and Eric was at Pangea at the time, so we spent a lot of time with Eric talking about this. A couple things we were missing. Number one, registering the product is essential in every market, and you kind of would think, duh, of course. But our feeling in 2001 was that there's this huge epidemic, this huge need for these drugs that countries and governments would simplify the process and bring it in. That's not the case, and that's still not the case today. You still need to file a unique, separate dossier for every country around the world. That is very, very cumbersome, very intensive, and takes a lot of time and effort. So we realized that. The other thing that we realized is that to do that in almost every country around the world, you have to have a physical presence in the country. You can't do it remotely. You can't just send in your dossier and get them to review it. And we were a company in 2006. We're about 6,000 employees now. I think then we were probably about 2,000. But we had no presence in any of these markets, so we needed to have partners in each of these markets. And one thing we wanted to avoid is working with companies that were going to mark the price up or really not stick with our mission of trying to really deliver low-cost product to patients. So we developed a plan to work with local companies in each of these areas. There's also one thing we also did in 2006, which I think was unique in the industry, and still is unique today, I think, is that we took everything we're doing in what we call our Access program, which is about 130 countries. We moved it out of our commercial organization and actually put under me, and because the idea was that if it's within the commercial organization, it's really not getting the focus that's really required, because these are incredibly complex markets to work in. And then I made my best decision ever. I hired Clifford over there. Clifford's in the back of the room there.
Stand up.
And Clifford Samuel in 2006 came and really, we've been, the dynamic duo going around the world doing this since then, and Jim over here also has been very much part of this from the clinical side. The other thing we did in 2006, we really recognized, again, something we do at Gilead is we look at partnerships, and we try to find out if we're not doing something well, we realized 20,000 wasn't enough, who is doing a good job? And in 2006, the companies that were doing the best were the Indian generic companies. And we just basically challenged ourselves. We said, well, we agreed not to make profits in these markets. In fact, at the time, we were losing money because we were overproducing product that we didn't have demand for, or at least we didn't have customers for. But who's doing a good job? And it was the Indian generic companies. So we said, well, why not work with them, license the product to them, have them make generic versions of it, and have them sell that into what is now 110 countries throughout the world. And of course, you debate this internally, and people say, well, what about drug diversion? And so we looked at that. That's actually never happened in HIV, really, in any grand scale. What about drug quality? Well, we had been, at the time, that was when there was a lot of discussion around PEPFAR of the tentative approval process. So we're able to require our generic partners to have FDA tentative approval. So you have an FDA-approved product, or we also allowed WHO pre-qualification. The other thing we're able to do is actually work with them on the manufacturing process. As Eric said, we can give them a technology transfer, but then also help them work on resolving any impurities or any of the challenging solvents they may use in the process. So our manufacturing group will do that. So we're able to really leverage what the capabilities of the Indian companies have, which is high quality, high volume, low margin business. So we started that in 2006. The other thing I want to say, I see, where's Anand? He's here. I spoke to earlier, is that we were able to work with we identified these local partners, and one thing we're also able to do with our drug safety group is actually train them to do pharmacovigilance in the markets, which is really important as well. That's something we couldn't do if we're not physically in the market. That's something our partners couldn't do at the time because they really weren't equipped for that. And so our drug safety group works on safety protocols with these partners. So we did that in 2006. And I don't want to take, in between 2006 and today, we've gone from about 20,000 patients to over 5 million patients who are receiving the product through this program. And I think there's other things going on during this time. I mean, funding is a big issue, and this is also a time where there's tremendous growth in PEPFAR as well as global fund programs, and also treatment guidelines advancing. But certainly, if you looked at the price of the drug at the time, we were selling at no profit price of $17 a month. The lowest generic price right now for the same product is about $4 a month. So it was also not a bet, but a challenge with our manufacturing group who said no one can make this for cheaper than us. And I said, I'll bet these guys can, and they don't try to debate that anymore. But that's because that's what these companies do. That is their core strength. Our core strength is research and development and developing innovative new molecules. Their core strength is actually taking those and making the process more efficient. So that's just in a nutshell what we've been doing in HIV. And it's not just us. It's the NGO community. It's working with institutions like PEPFAR, like Global Fund, like WHO, and working in country. We do a lot of medical education in country with local physicians and local other healthcare providers working on different systems of delivering care. So it's been actually quite successful. There's still a lot more we need to do in HIV, and we continue to push the envelope both in terms of new research around better molecules and hopefully even cheaper molecules, but also in advocacy to make delivery of care more efficient in these markets. And I think right now we're probably treating, Eric, what is it, about 10 million right now? Mm-hmm. And that number should probably be about 25 million conservatively, but maybe more like 30. Yep. I mean, in the US, basically they're saying everybody who's HIV positive should be on care. So it's a really good start, and we're way far ahead of where we were 6 years ago, but we need to do more. So that's been our experience in HIV. And so Veronica showed the slide on hepatitis C, and we've been doing research in hepatitis C since the mid-90s, but it's been sort of recently that you've really seen just an acceleration of the results of the research that's been going on. And we're at a real breakthrough moment in hepatitis C where we can easily cure the disease with very simple regimens that are very safe, very low toxicity, and we're getting to the point where, so for those of you who aren't really totally familiar with hepatitis C, there are 6 different genotypes of hepatitis C that make it complicated, and the different genotypes are prevalent in different regions of the world and have different responses to therapy. But we're really getting to the point where you can take one pill. We're a couple years away from this, but we're getting to the point where you take one pill a day for 8 to 12 weeks and you'll cure any genotype of the disease. That's incredibly important for the developing world because it's hard to do genotyping. So we're looking at these molecules that we have at Gilead that can do this, and we want to do what we've done with HIV, with hepatitis C. And there's a lot of challenges that Veronica put on the board. There's no PEPFAR. There's no global fund. There's very little awareness globally or little activism globally around hepatitis C. I mean, with HIV in 2001, there was plenty of activism. There wasn't funding, but there was a lot of activism. So we don't have anything really like what we had in HIV at the time. But I do think there's a will. I think that is growing right now, and you're seeing more development of that. And I actually do believe in the next few years we will have funding for hepatitis C. Maybe not the level we're having for HIV, and certainly I think it'll start in co-infection, HIV, hepatitis C co-infection. But I think that's coming. But we want to replicate this. So but we've done this before. We've been through this. So we're going to start, taking a look at what we've done in HIV and try to look at hepatitis C and how can we adapt our HIV model to hepatitis C. So we've been spending a lot of time, even before we launched the drug here in the U.S. while it was still in development, talking to the various NGOs, talking to ministries of health around the world, talking to different funders about what is coming in terms of the science, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges, and trying to get ahead of it as much as we could. And as usual, people tend to react much more when the reality becomes more present, which is happening right now. But we have made a lot of progress. So we're looking right now at doing a very similar approach as we've done in HIV, which starts with really the basic premise, which is to register the product globally. And we've learned our lesson there. We're not going to wait 6 years this time. We're going to do it. We're doing it right now, actually. The registrations are ongoing globally. With hepatitis C, unlike HIV, we have an added challenge, which is in a lot of markets, we have to run clinical trials separately in those markets to support approval of the product. So that includes India, that includes China, that includes Vietnam, Japan. So we're doing that. All that work is ongoing right now to make sure that we can get the product into these markets as quickly as possible. And then we're also going to be looking at getting is cost. Cost is going to be a big issue. And I looked at the reading material that you provided, and I actually didn't read it, but I saw that one quote saying something about that it's going to be a challenge with the cost of direct-acting antivirals. And I find that, from my perspective, we haven't actually priced it yet. So, so I don't know what cost this person is referring to. We've actually priced in one market, which is Egypt, and they're actually scaling up quite high right now in Egypt. Right now, they're going to probably be using somewhere between 50 to 100,000 patients will be treated this year with our product in Egypt, which is pretty good out of the gate for this, and we're going to ramp that up over time with them. So, but Egypt is a very good model of how this is going to need to work initially, which is governments coming in and working with us directly to purchase the product. So we're going to start with a tiered pricing. We're just going to have low income, middle income markets, and then high income, which is U.S. and Europe essentially. And the low income price, which we really have set in Egypt, it's about 99% discount to the U.S. price. So it's a very, very low price for them, and they're very pleased with that. But in addition, we are going to look at, we are going to be doing generic licensing. And we've been talking with our partners in India for some time right now, and we'll probably be able to, I'm going to look at Clifford because he's the one that's working on this right now, probably have those licenses done in the next few months. Once we get those licenses done, then we need to go through the process of scaling up their manufacturing process. But and so that's going to include probably somewhere between, we've announced it'll be at least 60 countries, but I think Clifford's now looking more like 80 right now, and that'll probably grow over time. So we're in conversations with the communities around the world, the governments, to try to find out which countries really need to have the absolute lowest price, because the generic price will be the lowest. And then which countries can we price through our tiered pricing model at appropriate price. So that's ongoing right now. The other thing we need to do is change treatment guidelines around the world, because what's something we also learned in the HIV space is that until the WHO recommends use of the product in many of these markets, they won't use it. So we need to work with the WHO to make that happen. So we've had a long ongoing discourse with the WHO on this as well. So that is what we're doing. Did I answer all your questions?
Yes.
More so? Okay,
yeah, that was great. That was absolutely great. And I've got so many follow-up questions, and I'm sure people in the audience have too. But let's go to Steph now and have you make some introductory comments from your perspective, your vast history in public health and health economics, and being at the Gates Foundation and now Dean of the School of Public Health here. Where do you see the role for schools of public health, not just this one, but also this one, and collaborations that are possible here in the Bay Area to feed into what's actually happening on the ground, the kind of evaluations that need to be done to really assess the impact of these programs, et cetera?
Well, you're being nice to recognize my new job, but I realized that the initial idea to have me participate had to do with my old job and the role of philanthropy more than the role of schools. Actually, while you guys were talking, I was thinking back to a meeting that we had when I was working for what was then the Global Program on AIDS in Geneva, when we had the first discussions, and you guys from Pharma will remember, but I think in 1993 it was still Burroughs Wellcome, right? Didn't become... Glaxo didn't come into it. Anyway, whatever it was the company that had AZT back then. And,
that was his company.
And when did the name change? Was it still Burroughs Wellcome in that? Yeah. Welcome there, yeah. So, and we had a meeting, and I wouldn't be surprised if you were even there, but, and it was in GPA, the Global Program on AIDS, to talk about whether we might be able to talk about differential pricing for developing countries. And I'm a health economist, and it just stood to reason, and that's what happens when you just learn things from books and not in the real world. But since airlines price their seats differentially to take advantage of the fact that the, middle-class person who's planning their vacation 6 months in advance will end up getting a much better price than the business customer who's making a last-minute reservation, and you can have a threefold difference in price for the two seats sitting next to each other. It made no sense to me that that AZT was being offered at the same price in Tanzania as it was in the US. And so when I tried to impress upon my colleagues from industry of that logic at the time, it became clear that diversion was an issue, but they weren't really worried about diversion. The reason that companies were not differentially pricing back then was because they were concerned about the impact of having a compound that was offered at a 99% discount in Tanzania, and what that would do to negotiations, price negotiations, in the rich markets, and less important perhaps in the US than in countries that negotiate monopolistically, Australia, Japan, the Netherlands, whatever. So it's been fascinating for me to watch how something that was in fact forced, and had in fact existed for a long time in the vaccine space, but not in the drug space to the degree that it does now, is now, I mean, I think the US doesn't blink at the idea, and I don't know to what degree that's different in—
They blink.
The concept that you would have a 100-fold difference in price is something that was unthinkable not very long ago, right? It's certainly thinkable today. I understand people are still blinking about your price in this market, but it has been an interesting evolution. So when I think about what is the role of philanthropy, so I spent the last 4 years at the Gates Foundation, and the one very important role of philanthropy, and the reason I suggested that I go third, is because the role of philanthropy is in many ways defined by the space that's not occupied by the two people on either side of me, right? So the Gates Foundation, for example, has not been involved historically in drug development for HIV. And the reason for that is because there's a vigorous and robust market for HIV antiretroviral drugs in rich countries. So huge amount of commercial interest in producing drugs for those markets. Actually, now recently, the foundation has become interested in HIV and in therapeutics. And the reason it's become interested is because we're at the point now where we have really cheap drugs, as you've just mentioned, and they're very readily available. Drugs are no longer the impediment to treating people for HIV in developing countries. The one very big problem, though, is adherence, which is a problem everywhere, but it's especially a problem in developing countries, in part because of healthcare system issues, and in part because you don't have the ability to go to second-line, third-line drugs as you do in wealthier countries. So the foundation has started to invest in long-acting injectable drugs. And the reason it has started investing in that is because suddenly in therapeutics, you're talking potentially about products that might not have much of a market in the rich world, for lots of reasons, one of which being you can't turn it off, and from a liability perspective, having a compound that you can't turn off in this country maybe is likely to have a much smaller market, even conservatively speaking. So in general, the role of the foundation is thinking about where is it in the R&D space and where is it in the delivery space that these guys can't act. And the difficulty of doing that is that when the foundation is negotiating with the private sector, whether it's on the development of a new vaccine or on the development of a new drug, what we don't want to do is spend any money that they would have spent anyway. And in the delivery space, we don't want to spend any money delivering something that we could get a government to deliver anyway. Because in the HIV budget that, when I was at the foundation was, between $400 and $450 million a year, which is a lot of money. But these guys will spend multiples of that to buy one compound. And these guys spend more than tenfold that in a year, right? So, and the NIH spends more than 10 times what we spend just on HIV in a year. So in terms of the R&D space. So the foundation space, and the Gates Foundation does occupy a very large proportion of the HIV space, and in part because it did that, many other foundations now occupy a much smaller part of the HIV space. We have to be incredibly responsive to what these guys are or are not willing to do. And that's a dynamic process. So for example, when the foundation started to get into the thought of producing monoclonal antibodies that are effective against a very broad range of HIV types, with the thinking that that might be used prophylactically by injecting antibodies into people to protect them against infection, that was kind of wild and crazy out there. It has become mainstream NIH. So in the R&D space, how to be complementary to the NIH is a constantly evolving process, right? Similarly, in the delivery space, if the foundation invests in something which can then be taken over, that's something that absolutely needs to be encouraged. And in collaboration with the private sector, you know, there are some things, I mean, we were just talking with Roche colleagues before, that it's very unlikely that the private sector will invest in the development of an incidence assay for HIV. Because an incidence assay for HIV will probably never be used for diagnosing incidence in individuals, and therefore the market will be very limited because it will be used for monitoring purposes by national programs, it will be used for research, but it's unlikely to have significant returns to investment. But it could have very important public health returns. So that's a situation where there may be a very logical reason for the foundation to invest in something. In the case of HIV therapeutics, that case wasn't there. In the case of TB therapeutics, or in the case of a TB vaccine, then you're talking about a limited wealthy market, a huge developing country market, companies potentially unwilling to invest if it's not yet de-risked. And the challenge for the foundation is figuring out when is it de-risked to the point that you could let private investment and the private sector take over. And one of the two things that the foundation has done recently, and then I'll shut up. One is thinking about how to collaborate in the private equity market so that, let's say a company was potentially interested in a new TB vaccine, but they weren't willing to spend $100 million for the phase 3 trial. Then could there be a foundation private equity partnership which would enable leveraging of private capital because the foundation would provide a stop-loss guarantee? And so the foundation's been doing a lot of work in that, on those kinds of mechanisms with other equity markets. The other thing that we did before I left the foundation, which I think was one of the most interesting mechanisms, is something called program-related investments. So, for example, let's say that Gilead has a new product up its sleeve that it's decided it's not going to take forward for an oral application, but it's a very high potency product. Very high potency being necessary for a long-acting injectable because you've got to be able to inject 3 months worth of a drug with a single injection. So it can't be something that requires many milligrams. But let's say for whatever reason Gilead wasn't taking that forward for commercial development for an oral, nor were they willing to spend money to take it forward for commercially for an injectable. Well, instead of the foundation doing what a foundation traditionally do, which is to give a grant and saying, we're going to give you a grant to develop this product, what the program-related investments can do is to say, instead of the foundation spending its grant money, so any foundation in this country, what does it do? It has a corpus of capital. That corpus of capital spins off income, and by law, the foundation has to spend 5% of that corpus every year. But the realization was, well, that means that that entire corpus of capital, which is an equivalent capital of about $60 billion at the Gates Foundation, they're very smart people that invest that money to make money so that the foundation will have money to spend, right? But the realization was, what if we, the program people at the foundation, could tell the finance people who are sitting on that corpus what to do with their money? So one of the things we could ask them to do with their money is invest in Gilead's product so that they're co-financing the development of this high-potency, potentially injectable compound. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, I'd want to do that in part because there could be money money could be made from that investment. So the foundation wouldn't want to give up the possibility of return. And so the way it works at the foundation is that as the HIV guy, I could ask the corpus to invest in Gilead. The corpus would do an analysis of the return on that investment, the expected return on that investment, high risk, upstream, et cetera. And then what does the foundation do? The foundation says, if I get 5% or better expected return on that investment, I'll make the investment. If it's less than 5%, then with the program money, the money that I would have granted to somebody, I have to make them whole. Now, they could lose their shirt. They could make a $40 million investment and lose it all, or they could make $400 million on their $40 million investment. That's their problem. But on the basis of their analysis, if they think they're going to make a 2% return, then I have to pay 3% to the corpus so that they're whole, so that they're doing their job, safeguarding their capital. And that's been, I think, a very interesting mechanism for how private philanthropy can help to leverage the private sector. And there are very similar mechanisms. So one could be an investment, like I just mentioned. One could be that we say to Gilead, listen, you produce a product with these specifications, we'll guarantee you $1 billion worth of market. Now, and why am I not worried about that if I'm at the foundation? Well, because I know that Eric, in his old job, will buy it. So in fact, what's the risk? Let's say that we were talking about an HIV vaccine, maybe not for Gilead, but let's say that we were talking about this for Merck, for an HIV vaccine. Then what's my exposure in terms of this guarantee? My exposure is that if I promise $1 billion to the first person over the line with a product that meets my specs, they're going to make their $1 billion. Now, he's going to pay for it, unless somebody comes along before they've made their $1 million and has a better product that people now want to buy instead. He wants to buy instead. So then I'm going to be stuck making the original manufacturer whole, because that's what I promised, and he's going to want to buy the best product. Or maybe I'm going to make sure that that first product is cheap enough that he still wants to buy it. But one way or another, the exposure that I have is not the $1 billion. It's the $1 billion discounted by the likelihood that they're not going to buy it, right? And so this creates all kinds of new and interesting mechanisms for how private philanthropy and private foundations can work with folks on both sides of me to stimulate the production of products that are appropriate for the part of the world that the foundation's interested in supporting. And so that's where I'll stop.
Okay, well, thank you.
I didn't say a word about schools of public health. We can come back to that in the discussions.
So start thinking about some questions that you would like to ask, but I thought I would just ask a couple here up front, and maybe to both Eric and Steph. So in terms of what we walked through with hepatitis C, not having the gates behind it, not having PEPFAR, if you were still at PEPFAR now, Eric, and had you been in London and seen all of the exciting data that was just presented on, curing everybody in the world with hepatitis C within 6 to 8 weeks, maximum 12 weeks with a, soon-to-be single tablet, would you talk to the administration about expanding the program? I know that HCV co-infected people are obviously being taken care of, but would you advocate for an expansion into HCV treatment as monotherapy?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it was discussed before I left. We saw this looming. HCV is a co-infection with HIV. Arguably, you could certainly defend that. Your injection drug using populations have significant rates of HCV and HIV in the whole planet, everywhere. And I think the utility of the treatment is breathtaking. So this really is a moment of being able to look at the 180 or the 280 million people HCV infected. We need, as a public health community on the planet, to figure out a way to get people in front of what is not the same duration of treatment that HIV presents to a medical delivery system, a lifelong interface, but a 6, 12, 24-week cure and I think that the cost effectiveness, the cost benefit analysis, which both should be done in a rigorous way, will show that they probably are both cost effective and cost benefit. And I think
making assumptions about price.
Making assumptions about price, agreed. But I think that so just to say it, just to kind of reflect the reality that these decisions are made with, it becomes a somewhat of a zero-sum game discussion within the administration around what can we afford to pay for. The science is clear. So no one's arguing that this doesn't make sense. It's basically an argument of can you pay for it. Then everything you put up in terms of the constituencies that take that argument both to the White House and to the Hill are critical for the type of underwriting that the White House would have to do to balloon a resource that would cover the HCV burden. But there's a will to do that. But I think that because PEPFAR over the last 5 years was dropped by 14% in its funding, okay? It was never going up, it was going down every year. We have a situation where I'm not optimistic that there is going to be new money on the table. But what that means is we shift it to discussions around how can we pay for it, shared responsibility, engage those stakeholders in discussions country by country, as well as foundations around what can we do in a collective sense to get as many people under the curve for treatment as we can. And we start to triage. Are there people who are more in need of it before others are in need of it? In HIV, the 10 million people who are on treatment, it's not the 30 million or 27 to 30 million that need it, but it has debulked the inpatient congestion that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. And that opens up the medical delivery system for HIV, but more, or just as importantly, for other diseases that HIV-positive patients now are going to die from. I think the administration, and I think President Obama in particular, wants a multilateral forum, wants a contribution from our European colleagues and not just the United States. And the United States is the bulk of your global health dollar on the table. If you say the United States and the Gates Foundation, you've covered most of it. You know, DFID is way down. France, you know, we're players, but they're, you know, so for example, the United States puts $8.3 billion into global health programs. About 6 of it was HIV/TB related. And the next closest country is DFID, is the UK, and that's about 600 million for HIV/TB combined. Then the next country is France, and they're way down from there. So I just, you know, we're talking about a whole, it is the United States who is the main player here. But that's not as sustainable as getting an expectation reinforced and supported in diplomatic channels that puts the expectation out that you, European Union, and you, richer countries, Germany in particular, China's moving in this direction, you need to think of yourself and the responsibility, ethical responsibility you have because you hold more resources. There is a flat-out ethical connection because you can out there that this administration has started to put on the table. So I'm optimistic. I think for Gregg to say that he thinks HCV is going to get the treatment dollars, I think it'll be a crescendo type deployment, but I am also confident that the planet will look at this and respond. That's too many people to let move through extraordinary periods of suffering and death, the leading cause of liver transplant, for something you can cure. So I see it coming. There is no constituency that I'm aware of that is effectively putting this out, although there's a lot that's starting.
I'm less optimistic than you are.
There you
I think I'm optimistic that we'll make a major dent in global disease burden because most people with HCV live in middle-income countries.
Right.
So, and I think that the Egypts of this world, the Chinas of this world, will decide that it makes sense for them to treat. But the likelihood that we're going to add another disease to the equivalent of the global funder PEPFAR, with what we know now about epidemiology, and I'm not saying we'll never get there, but I'm not terribly optimistic that, in absence some very important activism from people sitting in this room and sitting elsewhere, I don't see a groundswell of activism, and I don't understand yet anywhere near enough about what are the characteristics and demographics of those populations, because the reason I can become optimistic is the extent to which people with HCV can start to look like people with HIV from a self-generated activism perspective, right? And I'm not an HCV person, so I don't know the answer to that question. But that's where I'd be curious. I mean, and especially if disease tends to be later in life. I think that we had a magical combination of empowered, enlightened, educated, young people in HIV that was a combustible mix of activism that I'd be curious to know how other people think about that, the prospects for that in HCV.
Well, I think that really is one of the major challenges that HCV faces, that it doesn't have that sort of sympathetic, face that HIV has in terms of saving the babies and the sort of the disappearance of the whole middle aged or young professionals. You lose all the teachers, you lose all the nurses, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that definitely is a challenge that HCV has. But to me, it just seems so compelling because you can cure it, whereas HIV you can't. So in HIV, we always talk about the treatment mortgage. So, people that were critical of PEPFAR and putting more people on treatment would say, well, then we'll just line up with this treatment mortgage, because if people don't die, you'll just have more people with HIV. And the more you treat, the more people you'll have for, forever, for lifelong. But with HCV, you can cure them, and so it's sort of a one-time thing. And to me, that in itself sort of is the compelling argument why you should do it. But
what mitigates against that, I think, is the fact that HIV was such a clear death sentence. Well, I think that HCV is a probabilistic death sentence. Right? I don't know what that does to the activism issue as well. I mean, these are questions for me because but I think it really raises questions. I
mean, I think these are definitely challenges that we face. Now I'm an optimistic person by nature, but you have to be to do this. But I think that there's a couple things that give me hope. First of all, in terms of the funding, I think that people are very gun shy of actually saying they're going to do it until they're ready to do it.
Right.
But I'm getting a sense that when we're talking to the different institutions, whether it's Global Fund or PEPFAR, when Eric was on board, and today, as well as Unitate and others, they are thinking about this. And I think they want to do it, but what they don't want to do is take the foot off the gas on HIV at the same time. So they don't want to make this at the expense of what's already been accomplished in HIV, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. So it is a matter of finding more money and not taking from the pot that currently exists. And I think that there's going to be some fighting around that. But I also think that there's another thing that's working for us, which is a lot of the activism that I see developing right now, and we feel a lot of this because it's coming after us, it's the same people that have done this in HIV. So there is a community that's they're like, we've done this before and we're going to do it again. And we're kind of saying, can we kind of do it different, maybe work together this time, but please. But they're there. And I think that is growing right now. And they see this as a cure. They see this as an opportunity. And if you do some and the math on this is pretty compelling, because if you look even at the prices that Gilead is talking about right now, for $1 billion, you can cure about 500,000 people. Cure. That's compelling if you think about what you can do with PEPFAR-like money or Global Fund money over a 10-year period of time. in terms of but I also agree with Steph in terms of the epidemiology has to occur. We have to know more about this disease. We know about it in Egypt. We know something about some other markets, but Africa, we know very little, even what the genotype is and who's infected and how it's being transmitted. So there's a lot of work, but I do think it's going to happen. It's going to take time, and I think that all of you can be part of this, and we're going to be part of this, and I think it's just going to take that kind of support.
So that's a perfect segue to my next question. And one of the things everybody that works with the forum knows is that you can get called on to make comments. But of course, we also want comments, questions coming from you. But in terms of the epidemiology and just knowing, understanding the diseases, and in an earlier class, we covered, the fact that we have 6 genotypes, et cetera, and the diagnostic challenges. And we have people here from Roche Molecular Systems, and I think and then we have PacBio in terms of diagnostic. That's a little bit different in terms of this kind of diagnostics. But so what do you think, so maybe also a question to Clifford, who's actually managing these programs and sending in all of these dossiers. So you want to go and have these available for treatment, but there's this huge, sort of finding the patients, diagnosing them, linking them to care. So to what extent do you see the need for more formal collaborations that if you are going to go into a country like Egypt, well, you are not going in there, you're providing drug at a certain price that Egypt is going to do, and you're going to have your drug approved in Egypt so that this can happen. But to what extent are you looking at potential for collaboration, and to what extent are people like Trudeau and others, and Paul Baum from Roche thinking about this and what your role would be? And the reason I ask is because the HCV Drug Development Advisory Group that the Forum has just had a meeting in London where we talked about global access for the first time. Usually we talk about what's the appropriate control arm now that, sofosbuvir has been approved, those kinds of questions, which are also very interesting and important. But people really wanted us to start talking about global access, and people just kind of put some of the programs out there. And our industry co-chair, who's from Janssen, then basically asked the question, who is going to tell us what to do? Who's going to call us to the table and give us our marching orders about how we can contribute? And it was a very, very interesting discussion with people there from Quest and Quintiles who were talking about the networks they have in countries and how they could contribute. Merck was there, and we talked about vaccine programs and the tens and hundreds of thousands of serum samples that are stored that could possibly be used for just seroprevalence studies, for example. So our members are asking, how can we help? What can we do? So I'd like to invite some of you in the audience to maybe make some comments about that. But this is where the Gates Foundation comes in again, because in addition to being a funder, the Gates Foundation can also act as a convener with quite a bit of clout. And I know Bill Gates frequently does CEO-type meetings with companies and has some convincing power in terms of encouraging other people, to step up to the plate. So it's not so much government funding now, but industry involvement outside of Gilead and things we have already talked about. So that could be something that the Gates Foundation could help with. But let me open it up to the floor and see if there are any questions or any comments from that. Or if you would also like to comment about the need to collaborate with diagnostic companies.
So I say we're in discussions with a number of diagnostic companies, and what we're trying to do is two things: is talk about what we need today to do what we want to do, and that is really point of care, and then as well as a low-cost genotyping for some of these markets, but also being very clear that we're probably about a year and a half away from having a pan-genotypic regimen. So you'll be able to treat 12 weeks any genotype. So that'll eliminate the need for genotyping, which I think puts a constraint on the diagnostic makers. Do they want to invest in making genotyping when that's going to be obsolete in 2 years? But we do need diagnostics today to make this happen. But I think the most important one is point of care.
Okay.
I don't know, Clifford, you want to use the Clifford, do you have anything to add to that?
If you can stand up.
Sure. I think something that Gregg has always challenged us on is the need to not just make drug available, but to follow on with medical education and training in a means of helping to strengthen healthcare systems, because we find that as you get into the countries, you make the drug available, there are not enough doctors or trained healthcare professionals. And Chana, who's here now, he actually arrived.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, wrote a brilliant article in New England Journal last week and talks about, you know, political will and the need to come together. A demonstration of that is what Gregg and I have been able to do in Egypt, which is to really capitalize on the fact that the Egyptian Ministry of Health, although it has changed several times, in addition to the National Liver Committee, has really demonstrated a keen interest in working together to help bring down prevalence and solve this problem. They're talking to diagnostic companies, they're talking to Janssen and others. So it's a clear demonstration of how something can get started. We anticipate that we'll do the same in Pakistan, and there are lots of individuals who really want to see a cure now. So I think education and training and prevention, and also there's also a lot of reinfection for Hep C. So you have to focus on awareness campaigns as well.
Next question.
You've got a diagnostics comment.
Since you called us to the floor, Veronica. So I think we can draw a lot of important lessons from the HIV experience. You know, I think one thing that I'm struck by this panel is the importance of a multilateral effort. You know, private foundations, governments, and industry, and partnering to scale up. So I think one of the big successes that Eric pointed out earlier was around early infant diagnosis and prevention of mother-to-child of HIV. That could not have happened without some of the initial pilot projects where Pangea and Roche and Clinton Foundation really showed that this can work, you can implement it, and it's scalable. On the flip side, we've also seen efforts where, you know, we sort of came to the party by ourselves. One example of that is viral load scale-up in developing countries. We've had low pricing in developing countries in order to increase access, but without the healthcare infrastructure and systems in place to take that offer and implement it into laboratories, then, you know, what we've seen is a lot of underutilization. So I think the more dialogue that we have between these parties, the better. And actually, only recently have we started to see increase focus on scale-up of monitoring for HIV because foundations like the Clinton Foundation have approached us and said, hey, I think we can broker a deal between governments and industry to make this happen. So I think something like that would really be needed to move the needle on hepatitis C.
Okay. So I remember back in the earlier days of HIV, when the global response was first being rolled out, and WHO had this 3x5 program, basically meaning 3 million people on treatment by 2005. But they made a very big point of it being a public health approach, which basically was the same first-line treatment, and I believe it was D4T, 3-decenobirapine, was one of the first generic combinations. And as Eric mentioned, D4T is a pretty nasty drug. I mean, it served, you know, it did help people also in the US initially when that's all we had, but it certainly was not a drug that should have ever been distributed that far and wide. But also made a very strong point about saying it's a public health approach. We'll just treat everybody that's sick and that has a CD4 count below a certain level, except most people didn't have access to CD4 testing, but really actively discouraged viral load testing. saying that that was not necessary. You could manage it by clinical symptoms and CD4 testing occasionally, which, as you all know, the antivirals are antivirals. They suppress viral load, and as a result of that, the CD4 cells go up. So CD4 is not an immediate effect of treatment. And I don't know, Eric, maybe you could comment on that too, because you mentioned, the role of WHO normative guidelines, and if it's not on their essential medicines list, it's not going to be used, and if they don't put it in their guidelines, it's not going to be used. But I just wonder if we sort of lost a moment of opportunity there, because I think a lot of companies were really interested in point-of-care viral load testing, but there really wasn't this incentive that, Steph, you mentioned, that you'd say, well, you develop the test, we promise you 1 billion uses, because it was being discouraged. So,
But, go ahead.
No, please.
I think we're going to get there very quickly. I think that WHO is now aligned with what you're saying. I think that the international community is aligned. I think that some CD4 manufacturers are worried, to be honest. And I think that not only is it clearly better for monitoring, but I think the question is, how quickly does CD4 become irrelevant with respect to initiation?
Exactly,
I think that what we talked about before the meeting is that it's still very relevant for prophylaxis, but in terms of total volume, it gets smaller and smaller. Where I thought you were going, which is what I was going to ask, is, if HIV is invisible and needs a diagnostic test to identify who's infected, it's less invisible than HCV is. And if HIV suffers from a very long lag from exposure to illness, at least communities see patterns of transmission. They see a woman getting sick and then her husband getting sick, or vice versa. So the biology of it starts to permeate the culture, and the social norms start to respond. HCV makes that much harder, right, in terms of the likelihood of it being recognized as present in the community, and certainly not recognized as related to the transmission event. So it'll be interesting to see what that means. One of the discussions that I had the other day with one of your colleagues at Gilead was about not just the cost effectiveness discussions and not just the epidemiology, but what does that mean for screening strategies, and where does one focus efforts to identify people who could benefit from treatment? Because it's not like we have lines outside the door in the same way. And so that's, I think, lots of difficult operational, logistical questions to be solved to have effective large-scale programs.
Okay. And I forgot to remind everyone to introduce themselves, but you're Chana.
Sure, yes, that's right. I'm Chana. I'm from Stanford. I'm a gastroenterologist and hepatologist. And just a comment, actually, I think just to kind of pitch the research aspect of it, I think we need to know two things. First of all, what are the barriers to uptake, provided these drugs are available in these countries? With the HIV epidemic, we saw there's a lot of challenges from a behavioral standpoint. People did not want to take these medications. People had beliefs or faith in their traditional healing methods and so on. So I think we need to kind of do more research on the ground regarding that. And then the second thing is also research on the genotypes in these areas. I know there's a pan-genotypic combination that's coming out, but the case numbers, the numbers of patients who have been, in the genotype 4 to 6 range have been very few, and I think we need to do more research on the ground on responses in those patients. So.
Okay.
Well, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at UCSF. I'm working on human papillomavirus HPV, but on HIV patients. So we did, well, first of all, thank you very much for Veronica for this wonderful presentation and also this panel. From my experience, what I had recently, during my last 5 years as a postdoc at UCSF, was in the beginning, we were discussing things more on the intellectual level, the clinical, and then all the disease progression, diagnostics, and all. But then when I went into the focus groups discussions, and then because we were planning for a big clinical trials for the screening test for HPV. And before that, we got our challenge, Obama's challenge grant, and then we did the pilot study. So that experience really opened my eyes in the sense that as we're talking about, like with HIV population, the advocacy and also the community, the passion that they have. Whereas with HCV, we don't have that. I think one little perspective is that, like, unless we can give out the human stories, like the human face to that disease, because otherwise we would not get a lot of people get involved. Whereas with HIV, what I saw was people, although we were doing the screening test for HPV, patients who are HIV positive, and then people who are all MSMs and all that. So during the focus group studies, interviews and all that, then only they open up. So in order to get them into discussion also, we need to have the community leaders, the ones who are in contact with these patients. And then once we give them a chance, their stories to be heard, and then when we could attach, let's say, the human face to the disease, then more and more people, they come to be aware of that. So I was wondering, like, with for HCV, what kind of initiatives so far have we been doing, or are we still in the process of getting into this direction also, or you know, especially from WHO? Because I grew up in the United Nations family, so background, so I could understand the bureaucracy of the UN, and then it's really hard to coordinate at the international level. But then, but the common theme is, like, once we can give the human face to a disease, then everybody could identify. So I think when we can find a common ground on a human level, then I think that could open up a lot of doors. And then, well, that's my from my perspective. I was just asking.
So thank you. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, and
I'd like to comment.
Please, can you? Can you just pass that on?
So you're asking for a human face. I have a human face, look. My name's Orlando Chavez, and I'm here to let you know that activism is alive and well in the United States. There's not a lot of us, but we've been at it for a very long time. We're often drowned out by a cacophony of interests. We understand that there's an elephant in the room here that nobody's talking about. When you say human faces, does that human face include a drug user's face? Does that include a drug user's face? Because until you embrace that issue, you're not going to get around why there is no public sympathy for HCV, why there's no funding for HCV, why there's no infrastructure for HCV, why there's no linkage for HCV, why there's no continuum of care for HCV, because it all revolves around the stigma of drug use, in my opinion. Given that, what can these three gentlemen up here do to get other communities to embrace us? And that would include the HIV community, because I think we have a very common interest, a very common history, and that we can help each other in a lot of ways. But not quite sure how to bridge that gap. I've been to parties where you have Hep C activists and HIV activists, and the room literally divides down the middle. Okay. So, do any of you gentlemen have any ideas about how to address that?
Not. I think that the stigma is real. It plays out every day. Plays out in every medical delivery system that sees both populations. And right now, that's a lot of HIV medical delivery systems. The injection drug user has been marginalized forever. And I think that it will require a, I think of the 8,000 with the hemophiliac groups that is also, again, another group that does have HIV and HCV well represented in it. That was a very grassroots, slow evolution. From my perspective, HIV was a slow evolution. I mean, I remember, from the 80s on, there was no response to it, and no one was interested. There were no continuums of care defined or expectations put on medical delivery systems until the medical delivery systems were congested with HIV-related illness. And that's what led to the Ryan White Care Act. It was clinics in cities that were heavily impacted with HIV that lobbied the U.S. government after a decade to put resources toward it. It was not until 1991 that Ryan White was passed. And the compensation for the hemophiliacs was another long march to that decision. But I think that you speaking here, you being vocal about it, you having the courage to put yourself in front of a group of people that are going down an academic road is important. This will reverberate in their mind in a different way than anything we said. So I think your point about a face is a real one. We chose Ryan White as the face for HIV, who was a child who was ostracized by his classmates. It was very deliberate. It was very, it was thought through that this would be the best face to put out there, even though that wasn't the predominant kind of demographic impacted by HIV. And then having a receptive, entrenched, well-respected senator pick it up as an issue. But that was 10 years in the making, and we are still in the middle of every year, every time there's a budget, there are fights over how that dollar is divided. And there are many people within the public health world who are arguing that money should go away from HIV, and this is going to happen with HIV arguing that it shouldn't be, shifted to HCV. And I think it speaks to what I think Veronica's allusion to universal health care, the discussion that is now present after in my whole career, we were never talking about health care for everybody on the planet. Now, I think, in part because of Global Fund and PEPFAR-related examples of success at dealing with complicated diseases in very resource-poor settings, you can put a delivery system in place that can effectively identify, enter, and retain patients in care. And you can see drop in incidence. We're 2 years into looking at dramatic drops in incidence for HIV. But our colleagues use that to say it's over and we should shift the resource allotment now to other diseases. And I get it. But I would like it to precipitate the broader need, healthcare needs for the planet. And we should be talking about all of these unmet needs and how we as a planet can come together to respond to them. And that is beginning to happen in a way that it wasn't before. But so I don't really have an answer for you.
Okay, Beth. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just super quickly, I think you're exactly right. And when I was expressing my pessimism, it was in part related to exactly what you said. I think there are, I'm going to be the optimist for a second now, though. I mean, I think still today in the HIV world, injecting drug use communities around the world are poorly mobilized, right? And, you know, I've been working a lot recently in India and China, and, you know, you can see a hierarchy of mobilization and, you know, that's different from every place, but I don't know any place where the injecting drug use community isn't the least mobilized of the communities. So I think the question is, A, how can you do a better job in that community? But I would say also borrowing from the experience of HIV and saying what other communities can you mobilize? And what I'm concerned about in terms of that mobilization with HCV is that the community doesn't know itself. People die in isolated fashion. I'm assuming, this is not a guy who knows anything about HCV, I should talk to a hepatologist, but my assumption is that people in Zambia who die of the complications of early HCV infection, first of all, don't know that they're dying of HCV because that's not the proximal cause of death. And secondly, they don't have any idea that they have anything in common with somebody else who's dying of the same thing. And they certainly don't know about it early enough so that they can organize. While that progressively has been increasingly true about HIV. And so I think the question is, how can we some places accelerate that by identifying people, especially people who are starting to become symptomatic, so that you can create communities of people living with HCV, to borrow a term from HIV, and mobilize, at least in some places, effective community responses, and use that to then drive a more viral process. But it's a harder road. It suffers from many of the problems, as Eric says, but it's then even one step harder.
Just following up on that, I had a question about the relationship between the new HCV.
So Beth, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Beth Ponder. I'm the executive director of the Center for Emerging and Neglected Diseases here at UC Berkeley. So I'm thinking with my scientific hat on. I'm wondering with these new HCV drugs, what the relationship is between virus cure and downstream prevention of liver failure, transplant, and cancer. And if we can draw any parallels between the rollout of HBV and HPV vaccines and the connection with cancer prevention and the sort of cancer communities, and if there are any parallels to be drawn with HCV.
So I think with the new therapies coming out, it's too early to know because they're just hitting the market today. But I think the scientific theory would be that if you treat the disease early enough, not only do you cure the disease and get an SVR, but you also prevent the liver damage that would lead to HCC or other complications. And that's something that I think is going to be heavily debated in health systems, as it has been in HIV and other diseases, for the next 10 years, which could be when to start therapy and what's the benefit of starting earlier and can you wait? Because with hepatitis C, you know, 60 to 70% of patients go asymptomatic for life. 30 to 40% will get cirrhosis and serious liver damage, and 5 to 10% will need a liver transplant. Can we wait until someone advances and say, now this person is the one we want to treat? Do you treat earlier? And that's going to be a big debate. But I think the theory is, yes, you would prevent those downstream, you know, liver transplants and cancer. And I think there is data based on the interferon use already for that. But for the new agents, we don't have that yet. But that would be the theory.
That brings to mind the Asian American community in the Bay Area around hepatitis B vaccine, and that there was actually a movement in the community here to vaccinate children because of transmission of the virus among adults, and it created a sort of new community. And I realize a vaccine is very different, but I'm wondering if this is a pathway to help connect to these broader patient groups that we might normally overlook.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you can start arguing that this is a mode of prevention, I think that actually adds a new element. And we are talking about this as prevention because, as Steph said, you're not actually, yes, you're curing hepatitis C, but you're preventing something else that you're going to die from. And we actually think that hepatitis C is very much uncharacterized in the U.S. in terms of a cause of death. There's a growing amount of evidence that a lot of the deaths that have occurred from hepatitis C are mismarked on the death certificates as something else, so people aren't linking the two together. But I think hepatitis B is actually a very good example. certainly vaccination is a much easier public health argument to make, but treatment of hepatitis B has been very challenging in the U.S. We have very good treatments that are very cost-effective and easy to use and very effective, but because people don't perceive themselves at risk, because it's a long course of disease, people aren't using them, even though they will prevent a large number of liver cancers and deaths later down the road. But that's chronic therapy, that's not a cure.
Okay.
So I think there's a big difference.
That's the next one to tackle.
We're working on it.
Yeah. Any last question from the group? It's a very quiet class today.
Somebody up.
Oh, up there. Can you stand up and maybe come down and get the mic, please?
Hi, I'm Megan Morris. I'm a postdoc over at UC San Francisco, and I just really want to compliment Alfonso for what you said. You beat me to the punch, and I think you said it much more eloquently than I could. I'm an epidemiologist, and I've focused primarily with HIV and hepatitis C prevention work, and I just wanted to bring up a point, which is, you pose the idea that the epidemiology is very sparse in terms of the amount of knowledge that we have for Hep C. And I disagree. We know that now that we screen our blood supply here in the US, the mode of transmission for hepatitis C is through intravenous drug use, unfortunately. And that's a population that they don't really have a seat at the table when we're talking about medical access in general. And if you want to increase the visibility of that population, I think that the opportunity of working with advocacy groups, right now, this is a really exciting time in drug development, and we have some real promising therapeutics that we can offer people here in the US. I'm just going to focus my conversation right now on here, what's going on here, even in the Bay Area. But first of all, people need to get tested, and they need to know that they're Hep C positive, just like they needed to do with HIV, and that was a big, big player in reducing the HIV prevalence, both here in the US as well as worldwide. And we now have a rapid Hep C test that we can use. And that, I think, could be a really useful vehicle for increasing advocacy within the community. If we can see some visibility from people sitting at this table and in this room within the community, showing, in fact, that they're engaged in wanting to bring people who are actually at risk and are currently infected with Hep C to treatment. I have many people that I know personally that they know they're Hep C positive and they know about this drug that's coming out, but they know that they're not going to be able to get it. And so I think right now is a really, really exciting time to be doing this work because we actually have an opportunity to give a face to the epidemic. So I think in terms of advocacy and how we can make a face for the Hep C problem here in the US, it's a marketing thing, and I think that because their therapeutic angle is getting so much publicity right now, well, why not paint the picture that we want to have and start to bring the population that's hidden right now up to the surface? So in fact, when that drug is available in 2 years, and it's 99% reduced because this is a highly marginalized population that is the only population that's actually spreading the disease, so we can actually give it to them, then in fact, they'll be willing to access it.
You know, I think you're correct, and we know how to take a new discovery of an effective therapeutic intervention that results in a cure. We know how to target high-risk populations. We know how to move those populations into systems of care. We don't have for HCV in place the enabling services that are going to be necessary to successfully identify and retain many of these patients in a relationship, a therapeutic relationship. Because of and I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, but as a physician who's taking care of really hundreds of injection drug users at all stages of their addiction, but mostly from the physical manifestations. It's a chaotic life. It's tough to hold them in care. The majority of my patients now are IDUs who are still actively using, who are in and off of methadone and on antiretroviral therapy. And it is really a orchestration of support and a willingness to keep doors open even when expectations aren't met that you have to have in your delivery system. And eliminate the judgmental aspect that is a huge barrier for people to come back. And this is in sophisticated, HIV sophisticated healthcare providers. You know, there's still that need to think differently about the population. So, but again, I want to emphasize and reinforce what you're saying. We know how to do all of that. It's now putting that together in a package that can be moved from, you know, downtown San Francisco to Berkeley, but also to Kenya and Tanzania, Zanzibar, and Egypt, and, you know, China, et cetera. Those types of movements to scale really does present a whole different set of challenges, but we do know how to do it, is my only point.
Okay, so we're quickly running out of time here, unfortunately. I would like to close up by asking each of you to very briefly comment about, this is in the interest of across the Bay collaboration. So Eric, you've just come back and are leading this initiative. Could you just then, in a few words, explain what the implementation science program is going to look like? What is your vision, just very briefly?
Sure.
I think it would be of interest to this audience to know.
It is much about what we just spoke about. It is trying to take what we know and move it to where the burden of disease resides, and to target a planning process that is usually convened by the Ministry of Health in most countries with stakeholders that can implement, manage, oversee, monitor, and evaluate these programs in an excellent manner. And to, instead of looking at a stuttered or frustrated rollout with our colleagues in ministries of health that are undercapacitated, to start to identify the ministry as the entity that needs to be capacitated. And it is my belief that we can work with ministries of health to do that by using local academic medical centers, local centers of excellence, local private sector that knows how to do procurement and train mid-level managers, in a way that enhances and leaves a network or web of support that allows the ministry to do it for the duration.
Okay.
And that's the basic idea. The cadre brain trust at UC Berkeley, at UC San Francisco, at Stanford, the Silicon Valley area, UC Davis, gives us a huge fertile field to put that purse string around, to bring the knowledge, be it with a disease or with a system or even with a marketing question. But I believe the UCB-UCSF link is what will be the backbone of this, and we're very excited about trying to do it. I happen to know the Dean of the School of Public Health.
Oh, you do?
Who is a visionary in all of this work and has dedicated much of his life to these principles. And I think this is an exciting moment to try to pull that purse string together, at least across the Bay, now that we've got a new bridge up.
We got the new bridge. So Steph, you've also been here for a short while, and so your vision for the school and kind of in the context that we talked about here, and cross Bay Area collaboration, and where's the school heading?
I think that we start with academic excellence, and what we strive for is greater public health impact. I I believe that there isn't anybody who works in public health on this campus that didn't become interested in public health because of their desire to make significant transformative change in the world. And my vision is a school that maintains academic excellence and achieves greater impact because the focus of its research and the focus of its training does a better job at getting translated into impact.
Okay.
So,
Gregg.
I guess I think we're at a really exciting moment right now for hepatitis C in terms of what we can do. Scientifically, looks like we, for all practical purposes, have sort of solved how to cure this disease very simply, very cost effective. And I think we have the opportunity to take what we've learned in HIV, because I think there are many big differences, but there's a lot of similarities, and apply that to hepatitis C. But because we have a cure, we can actually come up with a way to actually, I think, do even more with this disease. We've talked about a number of challenges today in this room. We've talked about epidemiology, and I agree, the US is not the problem for epidemiology. And please, I was actually talking developing world where we don't know a lot about the epidemiology in certain places, and it's a challenge. There are reimbursement issues. There's just no funding right now, including here in the US. People aren't really prepared for the investment in the US right now for hepatitis C and globally to do what we need to do, and we need to really rally around the value story and the opportunity that we have there. The face of HIV and the marginalized populations for hepatitis C. We've seen that in HIV, and I wouldn't say we've solved it, but I think that we've learned some things in HIV, such as don't be judgmental, don't do things risk-based, treat everybody the same, but also make sure you have resources going into those communities. And something we're doing very much in HIV right now is trying to pour money into mostly communities of color in the US, which are disproportionately impacted and have less resources. And we need to look at doing that with hepatitis C, because if we wait, then we're going to find ourselves 5 or 6 years from now with having treated a lot of the white baby boomers who are well into the healthcare system and have missed a lot of opportunities. But the good news is we have this in front of us, and so we need. And I guess what I was really going on is that we have all these challenges, but that shouldn't stop us from moving. And we have to take more of a scientific approach to this than I guess what I call it an engineering approach. We're not going to have the perfect solution to all these challenges today, and we're going to learn. We're going to probably make a lot of mistakes as we try to take them on. But we have to come up with our best hypothesis of what's going to work. Go and try it, and what doesn't work, we have to adjust. And if we don't do that, we're going to sit here planning and planning and planning and never actually doing what we need to do. So whether it's getting out into sub-Saharan Africa, getting the drug registered, getting the drug available, not saying, well, we're going to wait until we have the perfect diagnostic to do that. That makes no sense at all. And likewise, everywhere we're going to be working, we have to move ahead and not waiting for funding.
Great, thank you. Art, I warned you that you would be put on the spot at the end, and you are no stranger to hepatitis C, and you're going to be involved in the Global Health Institute here. And
so it's late. I'm going to take about 60 seconds.
Okay.
I know people have other things to do.
The mic's off. Mic's off.
It's off. Okay. I'm only going to take about 60 seconds because I know it's late. I really have 2 comments to make after this really rich discussion. I think many of you know I teach an undergraduate course in global health with about 240 students. I find it a little easy to become cynical about global health some days, but I wish all 240 students in that course could have been here this evening for this discussion, because I think it really illustrates the things that can happen when different disciplines come together around an important problem, different disciplines and different organizations. So I really wish they had all been here to hear this discussion, because I think it really was quite wonderful. The second comment I would make would be to thank you, Veronica. I'm not sure how many people realize how all of the hurdles we made Veronica jump over to bring the forum to Berkeley. We did, in our inimicable fashion, make it as difficult as possible to relocate the forum to Berkeley, but nevertheless you persevered. This course and the opportunities for internships in Washington and other things, I think are just one of the many things that we benefit from as a result of that relationship. So thank you very much, Veronica.
Thank you, Art. So. Thank you. Thank you to our guest lecturers today.